Are we approaching the last days of human history before the final return of Jesus Christ to the earth? The Apostle Paul mentions that in approaching those final events, that there will be across the earth a great apostasy or a falling away from the faith. What does that look like? Let's talk. I don't know exhaustively what the great apostasy will look like, but I do have some biblical insight, I think, into some of what that means. And I just want us to analyze where we are and what we see happening around us and frame it against what the Bible has to say. For example, this great apostasy that Paul describes, the abandonment of faith, that is displayed in our generation by the increase in statistical surveys of a category of people called the Nuns, N-O-N-E-S. The Nuns are those who no longer claim any religious affiliation with any religion, with any sect, with any denominational tradition. They have nothing. As that number increases, those people have to come from somewhere. They are coming from other faith categories that they have previously associated themselves with. Now, these are not true Christians, authentic believers, but they are people that have affirmed at some point at least an intellectual identification with a particular faith tradition, and now they're saying, I no longer have that affiliation whatsoever. They are abandoning even the appearance of, and certainly the participation in faith. Another thing that I think will be involved in that great apostasy is we will begin to see increased examples of spiritual warfare. People occasionally ask me, why don't we see the kind of demonic activity that the New Testament presents during the time of Jesus? Well, the short answer is we do if you know where to look for it. But the reality is that as God became flesh in Jesus Christ and lived among us, it's only natural that as God was doing something more dramatic than anything that had ever happened before, it would be appropriate to assume that demonic opposition would increase in response to that, which is what we see in the New Testament. It seems obvious to me that as we are approaching the second coming of Jesus Christ, that supernatural intervention in very obvious ways in human affairs, it only seems logical that we would see increased spiritual warfare or demonic activity as well. That, in fact, is what we're seeing. For example, in 1990, in the United States, surveys showed that there were approximately 8,000 self-identified witches and warlocks in this country. 1990, 8,000 who claimed that title, that belief system for themselves, witches and warlocks. In 2022, less than a year ago, a survey of those who claim to be witches or warlocks in the United States, that 8,000 number has now accelerated to 1.5 million people who claim the title of witch or warlock. To put that into perspective, 1.5 million witches in our country, that's larger than the entire denomination of the Presbyterian Church USA, and it's nearly equal to the total number of Episcopalians in this country. It is no longer a fringe minority. It is a significant portion of the American population publicly claiming loyalty to the occult. Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation 500 years ago, speaking about this kind of spiritual warfare, wrote this in one of his writings. He explained why he was so serious about his denunciations of Satan and those who were in league with Satan. And this is what he said, and I find it incredibly relevant 500 years later in our culture. Martin Luther said, when God's holy word arises, it is always its lot that Satan opposes it with all his might. At first, he rages against it with force and wicked power. What he is unable to crush by force, he thus seeks to suppress by cunning and lies. At all hours, the devil is seeking to kill us all. If he could kill you in your mother's body, he would do it. Abortion, anyone? You see, the satanic roots of abortion is this increase as we accelerate into the last days, the hatred that Satan has for creatures created in the image of God. If he could kill us in our mother's womb, he would do it. That's precisely why, with the reversal of Roe v. Wade in recent months, we have seen this vicious and ungodly backlash and laws beginning to be passed state by state with no restrictions whatsoever on abortion. There has never been a moral justification for aborting a full-term baby literally minutes before it passes through the birth canal to be born and somehow walking away as though that's just a medical procedure like removing a rotten tooth. This is satanic presence in our culture. Besides those 1.5 million witches, occultists are not in hiding anymore. Such behavior used to be done secretly and behind closed doors and in dark places, but it's now public. We've seen satanic worship as a part of award shows on national television channels. In several states, the Satanic Temple has been recognized by the IRS as a legitimate religion. They have invoked again and again the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in order to demand exemption from abortion restrictions, arguing that the abortion ritual for the female members of the Satanic Temple is actually an affirmation of autonomy and that she gains life through the spilling of fetal blood. In other words, a basic goal of satanic worship is the death of children. President Joe Biden, not too long ago, appointed Dr. Dmitry Daskalakis as the new White House National Monkeypox Response Deputy Coordinator. Dr. Daskalakis, along with his homosexual partner, operate on the side a goth gym that is named Monster Cycle, symbolically built on an abandoned church building in Manhattan. As the pentagram tattooed on his body reads, "I have learned there is light even in the darkest places." Now that could easily be the testimony of a follower of Jesus Christ, light in the darkest of places, but placed on a pentagram with his social media depicting use of a Ouija board with a lighted crucifix showing Jesus Christ on that pentagram. That makes the message of his life motto unmistakable. The emphasis is not on light, the emphasis is on darkness. They don't even hide it anymore, and it will continue to increase in our culture. A third thing, besides the abandonment of faith and increased spiritual warfare, is that the last days, I believe, will see government overreach for the purposes of expanding power and extending control over the lives of citizens. The pandemic allowed governments to use health laws to gain control of essentially every aspect of daily life. I remember during the pandemic, I knew the game wasn't a real crisis when I saw the state of California open casinos, liquor stores, and allow Black Lives Matter's riots in their streets, but still insisting that churches needed to remain closed for, quote, public safety. Now that strategy of using health laws to dictate policy has been taken an even further step by the governor of New Mexico. Her name is Michelle Lujan Grisham. She, just in the last week and a half, has declared what she calls a public health emergency. COVID-19 restrictions in New Mexico expired about 6 months ago. Barely 6 months have passed till she drags out a gun violence emergency, taking to her office as governor powers to supersede the Constitution of the United States, which she has stated publicly is not really absolute. What she has done is she has taken the largest county in New Mexico, the county that encompasses Albuquerque, and she has declared a public health emergency and directed citizens to not carry firearms outside their home for the duration of the emergency period, even when those citizens have legal permits and a constitutionally protected right to do so. The contrived justification for her decree from on high will certainly be challenged in court, but it's just another indicative example of the use of health laws now as a standard process for politicians to get their way on other ideological positions. This order in New Mexico is bad policy and it's bad law. That's not a surprise. We should expect that those kinds of actions from politicians will come about more often as they try and send signals that they're doing something about these crisis issues. But what happens here is we have a governor who has bypassed not only the popular vote of the citizenry, but she's even bypassed the legislative power of her own state government in order to direct funds and restrict citizens' rights simply with the stroke of a pen. That attitude is an affront to our constitutional system, and the court should put a stop to it quickly, because what we're talking about is a word called tyranny, dictatorship, rule by executive fiat. Well, this is just an unusual example of an overambitious politician. No, folks, this is a sign of the accelerated abuse of humanity that will precede the last days. There's one last thing. Not just the abandonment of faith, increased spiritual warfare, government overreach, but also, I believe in the last days, there is a coordinated spiritual assault on families and parental rights. The sexual revolution was always coming for our children, but now the most fervent proponents of that sexual revolution are no longer even trying to hide their intentions. The state of California recently passed a bill requiring judges in cases of contested child custody to consider whether a parent has affirmed a child's gender identity or gender expression. Parents who do not support their child's self-declared transgender identity may actually lose their parental rights and the custody of their own children. This is not an obscure bill coming from a fringe lawmaker. This bill is being signed by the governor and is passing into law in California. Treating parents as enemies was the inevitable conclusion of the transgender movement's premise, which declares that children are being born into the wrong bodies and are destined for lives of misery, likely ending in suicide if their trans identities are not socially affirmed and medically assisted by radical body modification. Here's the problem. The dogmas of transgenderism are superstitious nonsense. They are metaphysical absurdities supported by junk science. Boys are not being born into girls' bodies or vice versa because that's impossible. Why is it impossible? Think about this. The misunderstanding is we are not gendered souls that are somehow mistakenly placed in the wrong bodies at the moment of creation. That's not the biblical testimony, and it's not even the scientific reality of how we come to exist as human beings. Nevertheless, our nation's elite have succumbed to a kind of moral panic and a virtue signaling here because of pressure by by transgender activists, especially in the areas of education and medicine, that these children are supposedly being born in the wrong bodies and we have to aid them in transitioning, even if that means keeping parents in the dark, lying to them, and ultimately taking their children away from them. We can hope that there's a legal and public backlash that stops this kind of wicked legislation. But whatever happens, Christians should not obey these laws. A government that moves to the place of physically mutilating children and removing them from their homes and their parents in order to do that is a government that has ceased to have the moral standing to command citizens' compliance. You see, the LGBTQ movement and its allies swore to us up front that all they wanted was the freedom for consenting adults to do their thing. They said their agenda would never harm the rest of us or our families. As California's law to steal and mutilate children proves, they lied to us. How do we face these days? Well, in 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter says these things. He says, the end of all things is near. Therefore, be of sound judgment and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaint. As each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the multifaceted grace of God. Peter says the first thing that we do is that we double down on doing life together with the body of Christ, the community of faith. But then he says this, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though something strange were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that at the revelation of his glory you may also rejoice and be overjoyed. He says, don't be surprised that the world's going to hate us. They're going to begin to slander us. They're going to begin to pressure us to abandon our convictional beliefs in what is true. Don't be surprised by that. But then he goes on to tell us this. He says, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. So resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brothers and sisters who are in the world. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. Peter says, don't give up the faith. In fact, he says, dig in your heels and stand on what's true. It doesn't matter if the whole world denies Christ. We will stand for truth. We will suffer for it. Those days are coming, and they're coming rapidly. But he says, double down on the community that you share with the faith, the faithful. Live life together. Be salt and light in the world. Don't give an inch of ground in this battle. We are not concerned about being liked. We are concerned about representing Jesus Christ well. This is Truth Currents.